Africa, hopeless, corrupt, dysfunctional, just not a place to do business. But suddenly, everything changed. Suddenly, Africa is the place to be, and foreign investment is flooding in, and foreign powers are coming back. And that's why we've come to Africa. When the global business media is suddenly interested, when even The Economist, the neoliberal Bible of free trade and free markets, changes their forecast from hopeless to hopeful, somebody should ask the question, hopeful for whom? So people died for the cause of Africa, of course, of its independence. Yeah. There have been attempts at establishing democracies. But in the end of the day, what we see is the French are there and expanding. The Americans are there and expanding. The Chinese are there expanding like hell. But where are Africans from those challenges that we're talking about? Are we going back to the same old historical events?
Most of our growth, we see we are talking about 6% GDP per annum and those kind of stuff, but they are coming from mining. They are not really trickling down to the ordinary person.
Yeah. They're coming from where?
From mining sectors, basically. We are
natural resources.
I go to my home village, and it's the same as it was 10 years ago.
Your home village where?
In Botswana.
It's about state priorities. They don't even care about the masses when you are talking about these deals. You come to certain countries, all state enterprises now have been privatized because it gets the state or the bureaucrats something in their pockets. Do you get what I'm trying to say? And in the end, they're not providing any opportunity for the youth. So there are lots of unemployment in Africa now. And people might want to travel out of Africa because things are just not working.
For centuries, Africa was treated like a chessboard by competing global powers. But for a moment, about half a century ago, it seemed that there was a sliver of hope. That somewhere between the darkness of colonialism and the horrors of an emerging Cold War, that popular movements were winning independence, taking matters into their hands. Africa was rising. But then the Cold War killed the dream. Moscow and Washington divided the continent into new spheres of influence. Proxy wars plunged the continents into civil war. But 2 decades after the Cold War, it seemed that Africa is rising again, that investments are flowing in. We need to ask the big question, and we need to ask it in Africa. Are Africans at last taking matters into their own hands, or is this just another scramble for Africa? Our journey starts in Kenya. Our first stop is its capital, Nairobi. Nairobi, by all African standards, is a young colonial city. It was built on the railway towards the port of Mombasa. Today, Nairobi is buzzing. It's the financial and trade hub of East Africa. You'll see trucks and cranes everywhere, developers at work, except they're not from the West. They're from the East. China is now Africa's biggest trading partner. In just 10 years, China's trade with the continent has grown from 10 billion to over $200 billion. At least 2,500 Chinese companies are operating in Africa, and more than 1 million Chinese nationals have moved here to do business. In Kenya, Chinese companies are visible everywhere, but they are remarkably camera shy. We were chased off this construction site and were turned down by dozens of Chinese firms before we found a businessman who was eager to speak with us.
Kenya and Africa is a hopeful land and is in the early stage of taking off. So we believe there are a lot of opportunities.
When Gawai moved to Kenya 10 years ago, he says there were only a handful of Chinese living here. Now there are tens of thousands.
The competition between China and the US about this land of Africa, I have my own opinion. They decide to look east. Now Kenya or Africa country will make a decision which one is better and which one I will take.
And Kenya, like most of the continent, is choosing China for its big infrastructure projects.
Their Excellency the President will now proceed to view the port layout display.
Last August, 3 African heads of state celebrated the Chinese-built expansion to the port of Mombasa. It will soon be linked to a Chinese-built railway connecting 5 East African countries.
Your Excellencies, that is what our region needs.
A railway for $3.5 billion connects into the port, builds ports. It's quite the achievement for Africa and for China.
There's ports already in every African country that has an ocean front. And those ports were built by another imperial power, one or another, in the last century. This is what imperial powers do. They build ports so that they can send their goods to that country and so that they can export from that country to their markets the things they need from that country.
You don't think Africa needs this kind of infrastructure anyway, at any rate?
Africa desperately needs infrastructure. Whether it needs infrastructure on these terms is the question. They are negotiating many of these deals on the basis of a kind of barter. Secure supply of resources for a piece of infrastructure. That's a type of modern barter. Most people elsewhere are not doing that kind of trade or investment with Africa. The second thing that they are doing, which makes this arguably very far from a win-win situation, is China is creating these very powerful feedback loops for its own victory, its own win, that really cut Africa or African countries out of the equation in terms of the benefits. So the blueprints and engineering, no turnover, no handover.
It's all Chinese.
All Chinese. The workers, they send over 500 or 1,000 workers. They do this for 2 years. I've been on projects where even the people pushing wheelbarrows are Chinese.
So what you're saying is that the loan is Chinese, the investment is Chinese, the plans are Chinese, the designs are Chinese, and the implementations and the workers are Chinese?
Many times even the materials are Chinese.
Oh, you're actually importing the materials?
The salaries of the workers are typically, or at least very often, banked in China. So win-win is a propaganda slogan. It's not an accurate description of this sort of arrangement. Imperialism evolves. It's different from age to age. The circumstances change. What doesn't change is the balance of power between the two parties that are engaged in imperialism.
The weaker and the stronger.
The weaker and the stronger. And the weaker has an inability to resist or a lack of alternatives.
Or to bargain.
And that's exactly what we're talking about.
I'm very skeptical about the whole Africa Rising narrative.
What civilization can one reference that has ever been developed by foreigners?
But you also seems to be creating an elite that are benefiting from all the investments, benefiting from the selling of the land, benefiting from the new security situation.
I think the old word for that, if you read your Frantz Fanon, is the comprador elite. This is not new. We just have a new class of elites. You have your kind of post-structural adjustment oligarchs and others, you know, who are now skimming off the top of these new deals.
There are three ways of looking at Africa's so-called growth and prosperity. One is that it is real. The numbers prove it. 7 out of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa. As a continent, Africa is growing at 7 to 10% faster than any other continent in the world. The other way of looking at it is that this is fake, all fake. It's a false dawn. Africa's growth is fueled by debt and the mass sale of natural resources. And then there's a third scenario, which is, yes, Africa is growing. Yes, Africa is prospering. But who's benefiting? Africans and their majorities, or only a few oligarchs, only the elite that is linked to global finance and global power? So which is it? And this is the question I need to take to the man in charge of industrializing Kenya, a former banker turned minister. You're a former banker.
Correct.
And you know what I'm talking about when I say that there is no real development going on in building any industrial infrastructure in the continent or in the country. In fact, your low-tech manufacturing has dropped in terms of production and in terms of exports. And now you're importing a huge number of Chinese cheap products.
Correct. China turned into the factory of the world, where not only Africa, but many countries globally have moved their productions into China. This is now the perfect time for Africa to become what China was many years ago.
But you're signing contracts that say 70% of the labor for all these projects is going to be Chinese.
Well, I mean, there are cases like that in different parts. It's not like
Most
that,
cases,
it's not like that across Africa. There's no infrastructure project that Chinese do without it being put on a tender, international tender, people bid, and the most appropriate...
And the Chinese win.
Chinese win. That is the nature of the open nation.
But we know that even before the process starts, because they're providing the credit, they're the ones who are ready to do the barter, and they are ready to underprice the rest because they have a long-term plan.
There are things that you can do as a country, as government, and there are things that you need to do with support of private capital or foreign capital. We must make the grounds convenient and conducive for people to want to come and invest in Africa.
But for the time being, this is all theory.
Well, it is not theory. It's a plan that just needs to be executed.
For most of us non-Africans, this is the exotic continent. Open skies, open horizon, natural beauty. Global powers have long projected their fantasies and fears on Africa. The continent represents expanding markets, cheap labor, and natural resources. On the other hand, it's the incubator of their worst nightmares: instability, ethnic conflicts, and global terrorism. With the drawdowns in Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. war on terror has pivoted to Africa. Last year, the U.S. Africa Command ran over 400 missions in more than 35 African nations. The U.S. is training, whipping, or running joint exercises with most of the militaries on the continent.
The number 2 in EUCOM, General Charles Wald, came out with a statement: the Sahara is a swamp which we must drain of terrorists. He talked of 30,000 terrorists having swarmed out of Afghanistan, through the Sudan, through Chad, through Niger, through Mali, up to Algeria. I've never found a trace of one who's been on that route.
Professor Jeremy Keenan has written 5 books about Africa and the war on terror. He argues that the threat of terrorism was initially greatly exaggerated, both by the US military and by African leaders.
So you have these fairly dictatorial governments basically referring to any civil society movement that had any angst or complaint against the government. They were being branded as sort of terrorist. It's what I call terrorism rents. You're actually getting money off fabricating, creating terrorists. And of course your opposition gets dubbed as terrorist.
It is being described as a new front in the war on terror.
What has happened in the last year or two is that it's got out of control. It is now becoming serious. It's become a self-fulfilled prophecy.
Worldwide attention is growing over the Islamist militant group Boko Haram.
What should we know about Al-Shabaab?
Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, which is this group, has
and
about
safe haven and training grounds for Al-Qaeda, exactly what Afghanistan was in the 1990s.
So now the global war on terror has come to Africa. And it's expanding from Nigeria to Kenya, from Algeria to Uganda. It's as if Washington has recreated its School of the Americas into a new School of Africa. One where, under the rubric of Africom, American advisors train African security forces to fight Washington's war on terror. So is the new military aid helping stabilize Africa? Or is it dragging the continent into a war that's not its own?
We're in a very tough neighborhood in East Africa, and Kenya has always been something of a safe haven. If you were to present 5 years ago the idea that in 5 years' time your country is going to be in a state of siege, facing a constant threat of grenade attacks, bombings, or mass-scale killing, we'd have told you that's impossible. The African intervention, in Somalia especially, was predicated on the idea that America was going to avoid embarrassment by putting its own boots on the ground, so African boots could be put on the ground.
Right.
In other words,
so it
lives.
outsourced the war on terror to you?
Yes,
the war on terror to you?
Absolutely.
So, and do you feel more secure now?
Of course not. I mean, what are the implications of that?
What are the implications?
Well, what we are seeing in this country, in Kenya today, is a total backlash, blowback, really, against our presence in Somalia. It feels sometimes, and in a lot of places, like we're in a state of siege.
Like a state of siege?
Yes.
Barcilelo isn't alone in these feelings. Even the Prime Minister who first sent troops to Somalia has had a change of heart. He now finds himself in the opposition and is calling for a troop withdrawal. Prime Minister, have you enlisted in the U.S. war on terror in East Africa?
Yes, it's unfortunate that we are in the midst of the war on terror. It's something that circumstances has imposed on us.
And it started under you. You're the one who sent the troops to Somalia.
Yes. We called it Operation Linda Inchi, meaning that there's operation to protect the country.
But don't you think occupation of Somalia generates more radicalism and extremism?
I think so. That's why we must have an exit strategy.
But you don't think the president is necessarily on board, because he just declared a war on terror?
Still in a fighting mood.
He's in a fighting mood?
Yeah.
That does not bode well for the country. Because as you said, the continent is probably going to need more stability, not more war.
Yeah, that's what we need, more stability than war. Exactly.
It's war on terror, war on terror.
Oh,
now, it might have not reached Botswana yet, but I think...
It's in Kenya.
Oh, tell me about
this war on terror. Who is it helping? I mean, when they keep giving us military aid, it's keeping the current government in power.
So you cry war on terror, you get aid, and you stay in power.
And you stay in power.
Are you saying that the new military solutions of training troops, putting money in new security structures, you think that does help bring peace?
That's not help. All you're going to deal with them is to shoot them and kill them. You're not solving the problem.
Fighting, I think, creates escalation. I think sometimes an eye for an eye.
No, we did not invade Somalia just because we wanted to invade Somalia or because it's fun, right?
Yeah. Sure. Yes.
We invaded Somalia because it was destabilizing Kenya. No, it wasn't.
It wasn't fun at all. It was destabilizing.
It was destabilizing Kenya.
Now I'm curious.
Yeah.
You actually think Kenya can stabilize Somalia?
No, I don't think Kenya can stabilize Somalia.
So why send the military in then?
Yeah.
It's just to make the situation a bit better.
Give me one country that was stabilized using military intervention. Give me one country.
Afghanistan.
But I would
Maybe Lebanon.
Wait. I don't believe the Kenya military was ever in Somalia to occupy Somalia.
Exactly.
It was to at least try to stabilize Somalia in as much as we can and then move out. It was never an issue about
But that's why America is in Afghanistan. That's why America is in Iraq.
No.
Only to stabilize. Only to stabilize.
Introduce democracy.
Let's time to bring democracy.
Introduce democracy.
It's perverse, even if it's predictable, that Washington would find its way back to Africa under the pretext of the global war on terror. Clearly, today's Africa security agenda is not set in Nairobi or Lagos. It's set in Washington. That's why we need to get to the American capital and speak to an Africom strategist. Jennifer Cook is the director of the Africa program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. On the one hand, you want to fight extremism. On the other hand, you support military dictatorships or military regimes from, Egypt to Nigeria.
Well, this is a pattern for the U.S. all over the world. I mean, it's not anything new in Africa. What is new in Africa is that we pay a lot more attention because we tend to think we have fewer interests in Africa. It's almost like the U.S. can have morals where it doesn't have interests in a way.
What are America's interests in Africa?
Well, obviously there's the security agenda. There's a growing economic agenda as well. There's also the competition, I think, for political ideas and ideologies.
You mean the scramble with the Chinese and the French?
Yeah, I think
the Turks.
Yeah, I think
the
there is a competition for global norms. We want to remain relevant and influential in Africa. And so I think that's where the game is going to be played.
And that justifies the 1.2 billion extra now investment in the military base in Djibouti?
Does it justify? Well, the problem is in the U.S. system, the military is probably the best resourced tool that we have. If we had a limited budget, I would say we have to be very careful to balance that with the military. You can train a military in Mali to, shoot straight and do the right thing. If the government that they work for is corrupt or weak, no amount of military training is going to fix that country's security problems.
Or perhaps the contrary. When you train a corrupt military government, that could probably lead to even more disasters.
Yes, but you have to get the mix of both, I think.
It's good to end on an agreement.
Good grief.
When we come back, French troops on African soil. Is this the return of the dark old days of France-Afrique?
We're dealing with a continent that has been doubly, maybe even triply wounded.
France saying it's just hours from direct combat with al-Qaeda fighters.
France is involved now.
Now, the French are leading the fight. I know it sort of offends most American sensibilities.
In fact, the most aggressive country fighting the jihad is France, if you can believe it.
When France invaded Mali last year, it offended Fox News sensibilities to learn that people they once thought of as cheese-eating surrendering monkeys were now the frontline force in the war on terror in Africa. Here in Paris, the news was hardly shocking. Many still think of Francophone Africa as their backyard. But it did mark a dramatic change in policy. A few years ago, it seemed that France's military was being relegated to the grand parades of the Champs-Élysées, that Paris was going to put its past behind it. No more wars, no more interventions, and certainly no more France-Afrique, that corrupting system of patronage that governed France's relations with Africa. Time and again, in the early days of independence, popular African leaders were assassinated or deposed in coups led by ex-French foreign legionnaires. Togo in 1963, the Central African Republic in 1966, Burkina Faso also in 66, Mali in 1968. In 50 years of independence, there have been 16 coups in former French colonies, more than in all the other countries of Africa combined. All that violence kept in power governments that were in line with France's political interests and friendly to its oil and mining industry. The system of interlocking military, political, and economic influence is known as France-Afrique. Even today, many former colonies continue to struggle to free themselves from it. France holds the national reserves of 14 African countries in its central bank. It has a web of military bases across West Africa, unparalleled by any other foreign power. And it exercises deep political and commercial influence on the continent.
This has to change and this has to be ended. So at some point we have to renegotiate the terms of France-Afrique.
Do you think this is going to be transformed anytime soon?
5-6 years ago, you had some very strong anti-French rhetoric coming out of Francophone Africa. What's happened? The actors who were speaking against France have been replaced.
Like who? Like where?
Well, for example, Ivory Coast,
and
where
else?
France militarily intervened to impose a pro-French ruler. Or in Mali, where Francois Hollande militarily intervened, suppressing a popular indigenous movement in the north to impose a southern leader through what you could barely call real elections. And that southern leader now, Ibeka, is a servant of France. In Niger, where Mohamedou Issoufou has, who is a former employee of the French uranium country Areva, is now the president of Niger and recently signed a 40-year concession giving away Niger's only non-renewable natural resource, uranium.
This is an exhausting list. Is he being harsh?
Yes, I think so, quite a bit. I was not supposed to be the French lady on stage, but
No, please,
have
please.
to.
Otherwise, I'm going to have to be the French lady on stage.
It will be dreadful. I discussed with an American diplomat, say, okay, French-speaking countries, your history, your stuff, tirez les premiers, messieurs les Anglais, quoi. Enfin, messieurs les Français, en l'occurrence.
How do you translate into English?
Shoot first, dear French people.
A text that is written by President Hollande and President Obama, published in the Washington Post, about the deep, important strategic relationship between the United States and France, especially in Africa. What is this relationship that suddenly has become so important, and why is it there?
Well, each of these partners has something to offer in this region that's being called Africanistan. The United States, what does it have to offer? It has money, it has military hardware, things like drones, satellite information. It has high-tech capacity. What does France have to offer? Boots on the ground and intelligence. The one thing the United States can't get in French-speaking Africa, because it simply doesn't have the language. The businesses are competing for their strategic resources, but the governments are collaborating in the war on terror.
But are they now finding that the bigger threat is not amongst themselves, but China? Economically speaking.
Economically speaking, everybody acknowledge the power of China, saying, okay, we can compete, they're just there. And no, we have to reorganize to find new ways to make business, new ways to make diplomacy, so that we can keep some influence.
And France-Afrique helps in this sense.
We speak a lot about the military intervention. We don't speak about Francophonie, for instance. 10 years from now, the biggest French-speaking city in the world will be Kinshasa. So it's something very, very, very important.
The cultural entrenchment in Africa is an asset for Paris.
Yes, and we aim to use it strategically.
And so in that sense, France and the US are getting involved to perhaps confront or contrast with the Chinese involvement?
Just to keep their share.
So this is it. It's dividing the pie.
We are all doing the same things, same mistakes we were doing during the colonization.
Dividing areas of influences within Africa.
Yeah, that's the risk that is at stake.
You know, it's puzzling to me that the same France that condemned the American-British invasion of Iraq would be so in denial over its own military interventions in Africa. Now, here you have a country that is capable of debating anything from the smell of cheese to France's rightful place in Europe. But it's incapable of having a frank discussion over its present and past relationship with Africa. As if for France, Africa is the place where truth goes to sleep. What is more peculiar is France's anti-imperialist socialist left that is no less in denial over France's imperialism in Africa. So how do you feel now about France enlisting in America's war on terrorism in Africa?
I don't like this relation and not even this formulation. I am afraid of the taste of the Americans for violence, and in a way afraid too of their youth. China, Britain, France are 1,000-year-old countries, a long historical experience. We are still ashamed of our last colonial wars. We have finished with all that. We have no more any strategic interest in Africa.
But now François Hollande wants to double the trade from $30 billion to $60 billion. How do you double the trade?
You are strange. You have a strange way to question. François would like to double the trade of France with the whole world.
But the problem is in Africa you have involved in 4 wars while you are talking about trade.
You like to mix all the question at once. Okay.
They are mixed.
The French reaction is the duty left by history. It puts on us an obligation to go there, even if alone. You cannot rub out history, it's not my fault.
France is a force, let's call it a force of stability in Africa, meaning Africans look to France, it has 10,000 soldiers, it has multiple bases, and it's involved in war, in intelligence on the continent. So it's normal for them to preference France for their trade because France is a power in Africa.
Maybe for them. In my vision, we are fed up with all that. I would have preferred not to have to go to Mali, not to have to Central Africa. But take Mali. They call for help. No one was ready. America was too busy with Iraq, where they should never have been, but they are. Anyway, we helped to destroy the killers. It was a 2-month operation. For the rest, it's their affair.
But you're staying there in Mali. You're not leaving Mali. Even after the UN comes.
I am as sad as you are that all these Muslims between themselves are not capable to find ways to speak and to reconstruct friendship.
All the new murderous groups, the religiously motivated religious groups, have all of them come out of result of foreign intervention. Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, ISIS in Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Palestine, Shabab in Somalia, etc., etc. Every time there is a foreign military intervention, it creates radical, extremist, violent groups. Aren't you doing the same thing in Sahel today?
I'm not sure you're right. You may be.
It's factual.
I don't permit you to take so quick conclusions. It's another conversation.
Are you trying to
if
bring...
there is a terrorist zone in Central Africa. It will be, first of all, a worry for all of you. Muslim people are those who live there. The better you manage without calling for us is the best. Up to you to treat the problem. You will not draw me. You will not draw France backwards to colonialism.
Listening to the Chinese and the Americans and the French, you would think they're all out there to help Africans help themselves, as they say. The French want to help Africans build democratic institutions. The Americans want to help Africans build security structures, and the Chinese want to help them build the economic infrastructure. But the big question is, are Africans benefiting from the new competition, or are they being squeezed by this new scramble?
The Chinese, if I used American words, are living their dream. The Western countries are living their dreams. Africans are being forced to live other people's dreams. So in this,
you mean Africa is living the China dream?
No, we've been living the Western country dreams.
Right.
And now China is here with its dream. It's yet to be clear whether Africa will live its own dream.
We need to distinguish what the African agenda is. You know, it's become very fashionable for African governments to talk about a new policy of looking east. The question for me is whether they are looking east or whether the Chinese are looking to Africa. So the question of what the African agenda is a very important one. Now, if you look at
But are Africans benefiting from the Chinese engagements in Africa?
Yes. On the one hand, there is an unequivocal yes. African governments are now free, have now been freed to actually make deals on terms that they can live with.
So the Chinese engagement is a step forward from the European and Western one?
In the terms in which it is creating opportunities for African governments to begin dreaming about a new infrastructural modernization age.
We should not forget that when Western countries were also coming to Africa, they also looked friendly. They also came in the name of trade. They came even with infrastructure. In fact, the British built the Kenya-Uganda railway. And in that early stage, they were not talking about their colonizing anybody, you know. How the Africans reacted at that time looks so similar to how Africans are reacting to China now, you know, in terms of they're awed with these good things that are coming, but they don't have a game. What is critical is to pinpoint an African game or an African agenda, in the absence of which becomes very difficult to celebrate any kind of achievement in the absence of a goal in mind.
I'm constantly puzzled about the fact that there hasn't been an internal debate on this continent about what we want to do with the Chinese. The Chinese are constantly having these conferences and, you know, inviting African governments for these debates. But Africans ourselves, whether on a regional level, at an African Union level, we have not actually had this debate. These are questions that need to be asked.
I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical that Africa has the leadership, that has the leverage, that has the unity and the coordination to do any of this.
We have to understand that we're dealing with a continent that has been doubly, maybe even triply wounded, you know, over the past 50 years. You know, the sense of purpose that was driving the kind of immediate post-independence generation of nationalists, you know, the whole independence dream for the continent, that's almost completely gone. I mean, you have the rhetoric, you know, you have the rhetoric of it being bandied around, but the meaning has been totally excavated from the mission. For different reasons. I mean, the kind of wars that were waged here, either proxy wars during the Cold War or else just civil wars, you know, over the last 40, 50 years.
Or today, war on terror.
Today, the war on terror, but also just as much as military and civil conflicts has been the kind of economic war or the war on economic policy that has been waged here. Economic policy has been externalized in a profound way.
But it does have African agents. There's an African agency.
There are African boots on the ground, you know, at various treasuries. But the policies themselves are fundamentally neoliberal and are fundamentally pursuing a line that was developed by the West.
But that includes both the Chinese and the competition between the Chinese and the rest. I mean, that has not changed that game in Africa.
Yes, but the terms, it's more important to explore the terms on which these an engagement with the Chinese is possible. You know, in a post-structural adjustment era, in a neoliberal age, how do you begin to negotiate your goods and services, your resources? You're constantly going to be pursuing outsourcing kinds of projects that will privilege private capital and the privatization of collective resources and public goods.
But that doesn't sound like development to me. It sounds like a lot of things doesn't sound like development.
But for me, awareness is a good step. To first of all be aware that you're not playing your own game, you're playing somebody else's game. It's a good step now to craft your own game. And in terms of the issues of trade, you know, if we are not sitting down to think long term, then, you know, you're opening doors and benefiting short term, and then eventually your country or continent loses in the long term. So I think the issue of how to reverse this trend is really on our side as Africans to ask ourselves when we talk about industries, who is running the industries in Africa?
We are a continent that is emerging, you know, from an era of intellectual surrender, intellectual policy surrender, you know, where your entire economic outlook and orientation was externalized. What is so encouraging, especially for political elites about China, is that we are freed from the conditionality regime that governed this continent for so long. You know, there's a little bit of policy petulance, if I may call it that, amongst your elite at the moment, saying to the West that we no longer need you. You can see we now have China.
I actually read in the local press a long expose about the rise of the African oligarchs. You agree with that?
We are in that state now, 50 years down the line, because we look at even how the political leadership changes, where the word change does not really mean the dictionary aspect, because it's the same group that keeps recycling itself,
right,
and holding the door on behalf of the country,
right,
or on behalf of the region, of the continent.
It's interesting to me when we talk about oligarchs, because the oligarchs are actually a natural historical outcome of the privatization of public resources, changing the face of the so-called investor, you know, from an American or a Chinese or an Indian to an African face. You know, it doesn't change the nature of the kind of exploitative, extractive policies that are already in motion. What you actually require is to totally reverse or transform the nature of the game.
I think it's a generational thing, because like our grandparents per se were, you know, dealing with the colonialists literally. So it was let's take in all this information and let's do it as they have told us. Our parents' generation is more or less let's imitate the West, and that's a problem because the Western ways don't necessarily work for Africa. That's not what Africa needs. But I feel like our generation is taking a step forward. I think part of the problem is people thinking there's no hope, there's no room for change, and that's an old thinking. So we need to flush out the old, you know, and encourage the new ways of thinking and bring that forward.
But the question is, now that you have multiple global corporations and powers interested in Africa, is that giving you more room to maneuver and to get better deals, or is that sandwiching you in among various interests?
I think one thing also we should realize is most of the time Africans, we negotiate as single entities.
Yeah.
If Europe is negotiating, you see the European Union, you see the United States of Africa, you see China as a very global major power. But Africa, we go as Ghana, we go as Sierra Leone, we go as Nigeria. You don't have bargaining power. It's just simple economics. Your bargaining power is not strength. We need to negotiate as a bloc. And I see African Capacity Building Foundation, African Development Bank, they should really try and maybe think about ways of we going as speaking with one voice. That's the only way we can go.
It takes a movement. It takes a number of people getting into the system and changing the system from the inside out. Because otherwise, as individuals, you go and you're fought by the system. You get caught in the system, and you become redundant.
I don't want to be in the non-governmental organization. I want to be in the government. The government has the last say. The government has the last say on how much tax you pay.
I agree.
In the private sector. And when you go to these meetings and you listen to what the government officials have to say, and you're wondering, oh my God, is this the best we've got?
Yeah.
Because as much of intellectual capacity, they don't have so much. They never demand for anything.
So it doesn't have to be just NGOs or business.
Yeah.
People need to get into the decision-making process
they need to
and change government.
Exactly.
We are the young generation, we will change it. Come on. No, we are the young generation. We will change it.
I don't know about you, but I'm not buying into this whole French-Chinese-American argument that they're in the continent to help Africans help themselves. We at Empire, we take it for granted that global powers act out of self-interest. But what's been striking for me making this episode is the dynamism and determination of African youth, those who make up 70% of the continent's population. Their political maturity has been striking to me. They have this Pan-African vision that makes it indispensable for African countries and peoples to work together in order to turn the tables on those who are trying to carve the continent into pieces. Cliché? Perhaps. Simple? Yes. But I say, brilliant.